Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a truly massive, incredibly intricate topic, globalization. Now, it's a buzzword we hear all the time, right? We hear it in the news, we hear it at work, politicians love to talk about it, but how often do we actually stop to unpack its mechanics? Well, today, we're going to explore exactly how this vast, invisible network actually functions, what it's done to our world, and perhaps most surprisingly, look at whether this entire system is starting to run in reverse. To set the stage for us, listen to this quote by the theoretical physicist Michio Kaku. He hit the nail on the head regarding how most of us feel about this whole thing. We all sense it, you know. We casually buy products shipped from across the globe, we connect with people thousands of miles away in an instant, and we vaguely understand that yes, global integration is definitely underway. But beyond that, there is absolutely no clear idea of where this planetary civilization is actually heading. We feel the everyday effects of this massive web, but its ultimate destination remains a profound mystery. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of such a colossal concept, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll start by defining the global web. Then, we'll trace a timeline of connection. From there, we'll get into the detailed impacts and outsourcing before exploring some wild effects on culture, climate, and biology. Finally, we'll examine criticisms of the system and wrap up with the rise of deglobalization. Section 1. Defining the global web. The origins of a deeply connected world. At its absolute core, globalization is the integration of the world's economies, politics, cultures, and religions into a unified network market economy. What this does, essentially, is diminish the absolute power of national sovereignty, which, let's remember, has been the main player in world affairs for ages. Now, here's a fantastic little historical detail. The term itself, specifically in the context of intensive international trade, was actually first used by Karl Marx. Literally back in the late 1850s, he wrote a letter pointing out that a true world market finally existed now that California and Japan had entered it. However, it was Theodore Levitt who truly made the term mainstream much later, in his 1983 writings on standardized consumer markets. Let's move on to Section 2, a timeline of connection, from the Dutch East India Company to the World Economic Forum. We can actually trace proto-globalization all the way back to antiquity. It had modern origins in the 12th century and then saw a massive surge in the 17th century thanks to the Dutch East India Company, which was basically the first true multinational corporation. But looking closer to our own era, World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab and the late economist Philippe Martin divided our modern history into 4 distinct eras. First, there's Globalization 1.0 before World War I, which was largely driven by steam power and the gold standard. After World War II, Globalization 2.0 kicked in, driven by brand new global institutions and trade agreements. Then, in the late 20th century, we entered Globalization 3.0. You'll often hear this called hyperglobalization, characterized by the internet and incredibly complex global value chains. Finally, the post-2018 landscape of geopolitical shifts and technology fragmentation is classified as Globalization 4.0. Now, what's really interesting about these two numbers is the crazy story behind them. In April 1956, an American entrepreneur named Malcolm McLean and an engineer named Keith Tantlinger launched the very first shipment using modern intermodal containers. By simply standardizing the physical shipping box, ships could suddenly be loaded mechanically by cranes, rather than being painstakingly hand-packed by armies of longshoremen. This single, simple technological leap plummeted the cost of loading cargo from $6 a ton down to just 16 cents a ton. That is a game changer. That rapid acceleration of shipping changed the economics of international trade forever, completely turbocharging Globalization 2.0. Section 3, Detailed Impacts and Outsourcing, Moving Money, Manufacturing, and Mines. The economic impacts of this interconnectedness are absolutely staggering. According to World Bank data, between 1990 and 2015, the global population grew by 2 billion people. Yet, incredibly, over that exact same period, the total number of people living in poverty actually decreased by 1 billion. The number of people living below the poverty line dropped from 1.85 billion all the way down to 736 million. Just to put that into perspective, in China alone, the destitute population decreased by 25 times over those 25 years. This monumental shift wasn't due to colonial extraction. It was driven by tremendous industrial growth fueled by the expansion of global market capitalism. But how does that industrial growth actually play out on the map?
Well, check out Nike's employment distribution from 2011. What we see are transnational corporations systematically shifting labor-intensive production away from developed countries with higher wages straight into developing countries with lower wages. You've got almost 500,000 employees in East Asia, over 250,000 in South Asia, and just 24,000 across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa combined. This dynamic effectively turns developed nations into post-industrial societies while rapidly industrializing the developing world.
And this brilliantly illustrates that outsourcing isn't just about manufacturing sneakers or toys anymore. With modern telecommunications, outsourcing now involves the global transfer of highly complex services and intellectual labor. Today, you literally have Japanese language call centers located in northeastern China and Spanish call centers operating out of enclaves in Morocco's Western Sahara. Even healthcare is globally distributed. An X-ray or CT scan taken in a United States hospital is routinely transmitted to India, where doctors instantly decipher the results, write up the medical notes, and beam them right back to the US.
Moving on to Section 4, Culture, Climate, and Biology, the hidden side effects of a borderless world.
Culturally speaking, globalization is very often accused of causing total standardization. We see this in the famous Big Mac Index, used by The Economist to compare currencies, precisely because the Big Mac recipe is globally standardized. But upon closer inspection, we actually see deep localization. Yes, sure, McDonald's symbolizes Americanization, but to actually succeed, they have to heavily adapt to local customs. In India, for instance, they sell the Makalu Tiki burger, which is a vegetarian potato and pea burger. In Israel, it's the mixed shawarma. In Saudi Arabia, the McArabia. So core traditional cultural values persist and even mold these massive global brands to fit their unique local tastes.
And this builds into an astonishing biological twist. We often like to think of ourselves as constantly evolving to become smarter, right? And for 6 million years, the human brain did indeed increase in size. But scientists studying fossil skulls have discovered something wild. Over the last 3,000 years, the human brain has actually started shrinking. Researchers used ant-based simulations, because ants also divide labor to survive, and they suggest that as we rely more and more on collective intelligence and specialized networks, our bodies conserve energy by shrinking our most energy-intensive organ. We simply no longer need to individually know everything to survive. Globalization is quite literally changing human anatomy.
Ecologically, the effects are equally profound, but to be honest, much darker. Just as trade routes unified the human economy, they accidentally unified the world's ecosystems by completely eliminating ancient geographical barriers. Through human-assisted migration, think of insects hiding in shipping pallets or foreign organisms traveling in ship ballast water, invasive species of plants and animals are introduced to new environments where native species have absolutely no evolutionary defense. This fierce competition disrupts long-established ecological chains, drives down global biodiversity, and is a major contributor to the current Holocene extinction event. Section 5. Criticisms of the system. The pushback against hyperglobalization. Now, prominent critics, like the famous economist Joseph Stiglitz, argued that this whole system has some very severe flaws. Environmentally, critics point to the practice of first-world countries dumping their waste into developing nations, leading to severe ecological deterioration where processing technologies are inadequate. Labor-wise, they argue the demand for a flexible global labor market, which means a market where corporations can easily hire and fire across borders to find the absolute cheapest wages, creates a race to the bottom. This strips away worker protections in developed nations and replaces guaranteed steady jobs with insecure, part-time contracts. Furthermore, critics suggest that global institutions like the WTO and IMF enforce policies like free trade and world patent laws that allegedly heavily favor advanced states. Ultimately, they argue this concentrates unprecedented wealth into a small monopolistic world ruling class to the severe detriment of local industries and the global poor. Which brings us to Section 6, the rise of deglobalization. Are we pulling apart? Since around 2018, triggered by global trade tariffs and severely accelerated by the incredibly fragile supply chains exposed during the 2020 pandemic, the trend of global oneness has faced a serious reversal. World trade is now growing slower than the global economy, and cross-border capital flows are actively shrinking. Just look at 2023. Driven by supply chain bottlenecks and skyrocketing shipping costs, U.S. manufacturing capacity saw a massive 116% increase. Corporate executives are now aggressively using terms like reshoring and nearshoring.
Heavyweights like Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor, and US Steel are pulling supply chains out of places like China and building new, massive domestic facilities. The system is actively fragmenting.
So the crucial point is how dangerous this reversal might be. The International Monetary Fund has issued stark warnings about this fragmentation. If we only see what they call limited fragmentation, the global economy might only face a 0.2% loss in global GDP. However, if we face a serious split where tariffs and severed ties completely destroy our global economies of scale, we could be looking at a catastrophic 7% drop in global GDP. Some countries facing intense technological fragmentation could lose up to 12% of their GDP. The disruption of these complex trade ties threatens to be particularly devastating for low-income countries and less affluent consumers who heavily rely on those global efficiencies just to get by.
We began today by noting just how mysterious the end goal of globalization truly is. Together, we've traced its origins from Karl Marx and the Dutch East India Company to the massive, historic shifts in global poverty. We've looked at the outsourcing of our very minds and even the biological shrinking of our brains. We've examined the stark environmental costs, the serious criticisms of wealth concentration, and the sudden, dramatic pivot towards reshoring and deglobalization. It leaves us with a critical, undeniable question to ponder. If globalization drove us toward a complex, fragile oneness, and deglobalization threatens to radically fracture our economies, what will be the defining shape of our future world? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you leave today with a much deeper understanding of the invisible web connecting us all. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.